There's a specific kind of silence that used to terrify you. The silence of an empty apartment after everyone leaves. The silence of a Friday night with no plans and no notifications. The silence of eating dinner alone at a table built for four. For most of your life, that silence probably felt like proof that something was wrong with you. Like you were the one person who didn't get invited, didn't get chosen, didn't get to keep whatever it was that everyone else seemed to have figured out. Here's what almost nobody tells you until it's too late to hear it any other way. That silence was never your punishment. It was your invitation. The Stoics understood something about solitude that modern life has almost completely trained out of us. Seneca, writing letters to his friend Lucilius nearly 2,000 years ago, said that it is only in solitude that a person can truly come to know themselves. Because the crowd, no matter how well-meaning, is always pulling you slightly away from who you actually are and slightly toward who everyone else needs you to be. Epictetus taught that dependence on constant company is often a sign not of connection, but of an inability to be at peace with your own mind. And Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the entire known world, a man who could summon anyone he wanted at any moment, spent his private hours writing to himself in solitude because he understood that real clarity only ever comes when the noise finally stops. Today, we're going to walk through why being alone, truly, deliberately alone, might be the single most transformative thing that has ever happened to you. Even if it didn't feel that way when it started, we'll talk about the real lived moments where this shows up. The relationship that ended and left you standing in a quiet house for the first time in years. The friend group that slowly drifted away. The move to a new city where you didn't know a single soul. The weekend you finally spent completely by yourself and didn't know what to do with the quiet. If any of this sounds familiar, you are exactly who this video is for. Stick with me until the end, because the version of yourself that solitude builds is not the lonely, broken person you might have feared becoming. It's the strongest, clearest, most solid version of you that has ever existed. And if this resonates, hit subscribe, because we're building a space here for people who are done being afraid of their own company. The moment solitude finds you, it rarely arrives by choice the first time. Usually, it's forced on you. A relationship ends, and suddenly, the house that used to be full of someone else's noise, their keys hitting the counter, their voice in the next room, their presence just felt everywhere, goes completely silent. A friend group that used to text daily slowly fades into occasional likes on social media, and you realize one random Tuesday that you haven't had a real conversation with any of them in months. You move for a job or a fresh start, and the city around you is full of millions of people who don't know your name. In these moments, the instinct is almost always the same. Fill the silence as fast as possible. Turn on the television the second you walk in the door. Fill every open evening with plans, any plans, just to avoid sitting with yourself. Scroll until your eyes hurt, not because you're actually interested in anything on the screen, but because the alternative, sitting in a quiet room with only your own thoughts, feels unbearable. Seneca wrote about this exact impulse. He observed that people will do almost anything to avoid being alone with themselves, because deep down, many people are afraid of what they might find there. But he also insisted that this fear is almost always worse than the reality. What waits for you in solitude isn't a monster. It's simply you. Unfiltered. Unperformed. Finally, without an audience to manage, the first time you sit in that silence, without immediately reaching for a distraction, something remarkable happens. It's uncomfortable, yes. It might even feel unbearable for the first 10 or 20 minutes. But if you stay in it, something on the other side of that discomfort starts to emerge. A kind of quiet you haven't felt in years, maybe ever. Think about the specific moment someone moves into a new apartment after a breakup. Boxes still half unpacked, and the first night alone hits harder than expected. Not because anything bad happened that day, but because the absence of another person's presence suddenly feels enormous in a space built for one. Or think about the person who lost touch with their entire friend group after a job change and found themselves eating lunch alone at their desk for the first time in years, phone in hand, scrolling just to have something to look at besides the empty chair across from them. These moments feel like failure in the moment they're happening. They rarely feel that way in hindsight. You stop performing for an audience that was never really watching. Think about how much of your daily life has been shaped, consciously or not, by an audience. What you wear, what you post, what you say at dinner, how you react to news, what opinions you voice out loud, and which ones you quietly keep to yourself because they might not land well with the people around you. Most of us spend an exhausting amount of energy managing how we're perceived, curating a version of ourselves that will be accepted, liked, approved of. Epictetus taught that true freedom begins the moment you stop caring what other people think about things that are entirely your own business. And there is no faster teacher of this lesson than solitude. When there's no one in the room, there's no one to perform for. You eat what you actually want to eat, not what looks good on a plate for someone else. You cry when you need to cry, without managing someone else's discomfort about it. You think thoughts all the way through, without editing them for an audience that isn't even there. This is where a lot of people discover something startling. They don't actually know what they like, what they believe, or who they are. Separate from the people they've spent years around. Years of adjusting yourself to fit into relationships, friend groups, family expectations, and workplace culture can quietly erase the line between who you actually are and who you've been trained to appear as. Solitude is the only environment honest enough to hand that line back to you. Picture someone who spends a weekend completely alone for the first time in years. No plans, no calls, nothing scheduled. By Saturday afternoon, the silence feels almost unbearable. They clean the apartment twice. They reorganize a drawer that didn't need reorganizing. Anything to avoid sitting still. But by Sunday, something shifts. They make a cup of coffee and just sit with it, actually tasting it, actually noticing the light coming through the window, actually hearing their own thoughts without immediately drowning them out. That's not loneliness. That's the beginning of self-recovery. You learn the difference between loneliness and solitude. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation because the two get confused constantly, and confusing them keeps people trapped in relationships and situations that were never actually good for them, purely out of fear of being alone. Loneliness is a feeling of disconnection, even when surrounded by people. You can feel intensely lonely in a crowded room, in a marriage, in a friend group, at a party. Because loneliness has nothing to do with how many people are physically near you, and everything to do with whether you feel truly seen and understood. Solitude, by contrast, is simply the state of being physically alone, and it can be either painful or profoundly nourishing, entirely depending on your relationship with yourself. The Stoics drew this line clearly. Seneca noted that a person who cannot bear their own company in solitude will not find relief by surrounding themselves with others. They'll simply be lonely in a crowd instead of lonely in a room. And the second version is often more exhausting because it comes with the added effort of pretending you're not lonely at all. Here's the real, practical shift this understanding creates. Once you learn to be genuinely comfortable in solitude, you stop settling for relationships and friendships out of fear of being alone. You've probably watched someone, maybe even yourself, stay in a relationship far longer than it deserved. Not because it was good, but because the idea of an empty apartment felt scarier than the daily disappointment of being with the wrong person. Once solitude stops being something you fear, that fear stops making your decisions for you. You start choosing people because you want them in your life, not because you're terrified of what happens if you don't have anyone. Think about someone who spent years in a friendship that quietly drained them. Constant one-sided conversations, plans that only ever happened on the other person's terms, a nagging feeling of exhaustion after every interaction. They stayed anyway, for years, because the alternative, having no plans on a Friday night, no one to call, felt unbearable. It wasn't until they learned to actually enjoy their own company that they found the courage to let that friendship fade. And on the other side of that letting go wasn't the empty, lonely life they'd feared. It was relief, followed eventually by better, more genuine connections that had actual room to exist once the draining ones stopped taking up all the space. Your own judgment becomes something you can trust. Again, there's a particular kind of confidence that only gets built in solitude, and it cannot be built any other way, because it requires making decisions with no one else's input, sitting with the consequences, and discovering that you handled it. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the importance of returning to your own mind, treating it like a quiet retreat you could visit any time you needed clarity, away from the opinions and noise of everyone else. He believed that a person who constantly needs outside validation to make decisions never actually develops real judgment of their own. They simply borrow judgment from whoever happens to be standing nearby. Think about how many decisions in your life have been quietly outsourced to a partner's opinion, to what your friends would think, to what looks right on paper, to advice you didn't actually agree with but followed anyway, because it was easier than trusting yourself. Solitude strips all of that away. When you're planning your own evening, your own weekend, your own next step in life, with no one else's voice in the room, you're forced to actually ask yourself what you want, and then live with the answer. This is uncomfortable at first, because you might discover you don't fully trust your own judgment yet, but every small decision made alone and followed through, the trip you planned by yourself, the hobby you picked up with no one to impress, the evening you spent doing exactly what you wanted instead of what would please someone else, builds a kind of muscle. Over time, that muscle becomes real self-trust, and self-trust is one of the rarest, most valuable things a person can own. Consider someone who books a solo trip for the first time, terrified of eating dinner alone in a restaurant in a city where they know absolutely no one. The first night, they bring a book just to have something to hide behind, glancing around the room, convinced everyone is watching them and judging the empty seat across the table. By the third night, something shifts. They stop bringing the book. They just sit, order what they want, watch the room, and realize nobody was ever paying attention in the first place. The only person who thought their solitude was a spectacle was them. That realization, small as it seems, quietly rewires how a person moves through the rest of their life. You finally hear what you've been avoiding. There's a reason solitude scares people so deeply, and it's rarely about the silence itself. It's about what the silence eventually forces you to hear. Grief you never fully processed. A career path you're not actually happy with. A relationship you've been avoiding being honest about, even with yourself. Old wounds that got buried under busyness instead of actually healed. Noise is an incredible distraction. A full calendar, constant company, endless scrolling. All of it works remarkably well at keeping difficult truths just quiet enough that you never have to fully face them, but eventually, in enough silence, those truths get loud enough to hear anyway. Epictetus taught that the things we resist looking at directly are almost always the things that have the most control over us. Solitude, uncomfortable as it is, becomes the place where you finally get honest. Not because you set out to, but because there's nothing left to distract you from it. Someone sitting alone in their apartment on a random evening might suddenly find themselves crying over something they didn't even realize they were still carrying. A parent's passing, a friendship that quietly ended years ago, a version of their life they thought they'd have by now. That never happened. That's not weakness breaking through. That's healing, finally getting the space it needed to begin. This is one of the most valuable, if painful, gifts solitude offers. It doesn't let you keep avoiding yourself forever. And on the other side of that avoidance is a kind of peace that noise could never have given you. Because noise only ever postpones what solitude finally resolves. You discover what you actually enjoy without anyone else's approval. So much of what we call hobbies or interests gets shaped quietly by other people. You watched certain shows because your friend group was into them. You ate at certain restaurants because your partner preferred them. You avoided certain activities because nobody around you was interested, and doing them alone felt embarrassing. Solitude removes every one of those filters. When there's no one to consider, no one's preferences to accommodate, you're finally free to discover what you actually like. Not what looks good to like, not what keeps the peace, but what genuinely lights something up inside you. This might mean finally going to that museum you always wanted to visit, but nobody else was interested in. It might mean cooking a meal exactly the way you like it, with no compromises. It might mean sitting in a coffee shop with a book for an entire afternoon, something that used to feel unbearably lonely and now feels like one of the best parts of your week. People who build a real relationship with solitude often describe a strange phenomenon. They start looking forward to time alone. Not because they don't value other people, but because that time has become genuinely, deeply theirs. The Stoics believed that a life well lived required knowing your own nature, your actual preferences, values, and sources of joy. Separate from any performance for anyone else. Solitude is the only laboratory honest enough to reveal that information clearly. You become someone other people actually want to be around. Here's the paradox almost nobody expects. Learning to be genuinely comfortable alone tends to make your relationships significantly better, not worse. People who cannot tolerate their own company often bring a quiet neediness into every relationship they're in. An unspoken expectation that someone else needs to fill every gap, entertain every silence, manage every uncomfortable emotion for them. Someone who has built a real relationship with solitude shows up differently. They're not in a relationship or a friendship because they're terrified of the alternative. They're in it because they genuinely want to be. And that distinction changes everything about how they show up. Less anxious, less controlling, less exhausting to be around, because they're not silently asking the other person to be responsible for their entire emotional well-being. Think about the difference between spending time with someone who clearly needs your constant attention to feel okay versus someone who is simply glad to be there, but would also be completely fine if the plans fell through. The second person is almost always more magnetic, more relaxed, easier to actually enjoy, precisely because their sense of self isn't hanging entirely on your presence. Solitude builds that person. Fear of being alone destroys it. Think about a friend or a partner you've known who always seemed calm, easy, never desperate for reassurance, never checking their phone, anxiously waiting for a reply. Chances are, that person had already done the work of being okay on their own, long before you ever met them. Compare that to someone who texts constantly, who seems to unravel a little every time plans change last minute, who treats every small silence in a conversation like a crisis to be managed. The difference between those two people usually isn't circumstance. It's whether they've built a real working relationship with their own solitude, or whether they're still quietly terrified of it. The life you build in solitude belongs entirely to you. Perhaps the deepest gift solitude offers is this: a life built during genuine, chosen solitude is a life built on your actual values, not on compromise, not on fear, not on the quiet erosion of self that happens when you're always adjusting to fit someone else's expectations. This doesn't mean isolating yourself forever, and it doesn't mean relationships and community don't matter. The Stoics valued genuine connection deeply, and so should you. But there's a profound difference between choosing connection from a place of wholeness and grabbing at connection out of fear of being left with only yourself. One builds a life. The other builds a hiding place. Marcus Aurelius wrote that very little is needed to make a happy life, and that it is all within your own thinking. That single idea, fully absorbed, changes the entire relationship you have with being alone. It stops being the thing you're desperately trying to escape and becomes, instead, the one place where your actual life, clear-eyed, honest, entirely your own, finally has room to exist. What this actually looks like. Starting today. If any of this resonated, here's where to start. Spend one evening this week completely alone, with no distractions you'd normally reach for. No television running in the background, no endless scrolling, just you in a quiet room for even 30 minutes. Notice what comes up. Notice what you're tempted to escape from, and try, just once, staying instead of running. Pay attention to the decisions you've been outsourcing to other people's opinions, and practice making one small decision this week based entirely on what you actually want, without asking anyone else first. Notice how uncomfortable and how strangely freeing that feels. And the next time silence arrives, a quiet weekend, an empty evening, a moment with no plans and no one around, try meeting it differently than you have before, not as proof that something is missing from your life, but as an invitation to finally, honestly, meet the person you've been too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to sit with for years. That person, it turns out, is not someone to be afraid of. That person is exactly who you needed to become. If this gave you something to think about today, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments. What's the first thing you're going to do the next time you find yourself alone? Stay grounded, stay honest with yourself, and remember, the silence you've been running from might just be the beginning of the strongest version of you.